Okay, our third speaker, it's very exciting. He's called Luke Caverns, and he's an anthropologist who studied at South Texas University. He's literally the next generation Indiana Jones. Literally dresses like him as well. He's also probably going to have like a leather jacket brand in a few years. And you need a whip, dude. Where's your whip? Recently, he's been to Central America, and he's literally going out and researching on foot. He's doing reconnaissance work in the jungle, and he's going to be telling us a little bit about that. The stars really aligned to get him here. We were in need to find some more speakers, and I found Luke on TikTok. He's got an amazing TikTok and a YouTube channel and an Instagram, and he's just smashing out some really amazing content, and I was like, George, we've got to get this guy down here. So a big round of applause to Luke Caverns.
Hey there, you guys. How's everybody doing? I just have to say, as a 25-year-old anthropologist, it's a bit overwhelming in some ways to be up here talking about my profession and field of study. Typically, it's a long time before traditional academics are, given the honor of speaking in front of this many people. But that's just the power of the internet and entrepreneurship, things like that. I want to say at first, thank you to Johanna, wherever she is. I would not be speaking up here if it wasn't for her putting in a good word for me, for George. And wherever George is, he's put together an event that's not like any other academic, scientific event that I've seen before. Getting to speak to everybody last night, it really feels like a community of people who largely were like me, just a fan for years, following all of the other speakers, and probably experiencing a lot of these interests on their own, and then arriving here and getting to meet so many people that I, and I'm sure almost everybody else everybody else has just clicked with instantly. So let's just give a round of applause for George for putting this together. So I'm fortunate enough to be a little self-gratuitous with my speech. I get to sit up here and talk to you guys about the stuff that I love, and that's really amazing. So my speech today is called Mayan Atlantis, and my intention is to not try to make a direct connection between the Maya civilization and the long-lost fabled Atlantis, but to show you two things. To show you that the world of Mesoamerica and the Maya in particular could easily be seen as a second Atlantis. They, in many ways, created their own civilization, created their own cultures, their own ways of living, and they had knowledge of the cosmos and of complex mathematics and science. And in the mysteries surrounding the Maya could, in my opinion, in the way that I view the Maya, I see it as another Atlantis. The second thing I want to do is show you how the study of Mesoamerica and the archaeologists who work in Central America, and really, I would say South America and North America as well, how they should really serve as an example for the rest of the world as to how we can study other ancient sites. So, let's see if I can hitting. Sorry guys, I'm trying to get to the next slide here. Oh, there we go, okay. So about me, just real brief. My interest in ancient history started from the time that I was a kid. I think probably most notably, I saw the Brad Pitt movie Troy, and I was just infatuated after that. I saw my grandpa had a book called Lost Cities. It was printed the month I was born, August 1997, and I couldn't really read that well at 6 or 7 years old, but I could read the words Troy, and I stole that book from him, and I still have it to this day. And over time, that love for ancient history, and I would go to church and I would hear these kind of sugar-coated stories about the Bible, and I was like, well, I really think I would connect more if I knew more about the history of the Bible and the people who lived during that time. And I didn't realize as a kid that was me growing into a cultural anthropologist, that I wanted to study ancient culture. In my current work, I work in edutainment. I don't know if that's a real word, but it's education entertainment. So pretty much I make videos about all different kinds of ancient cultures, ancient mysteries, some that are based in hard academic evidence and some that's more speculative, and as the mainstream would call it, pseudo-archaeology. So kind of what I'm working on right now is the Belize Valley Archaeological Reconnaissance Project. That's under Dr. Jamie Awi. He's one of the best archaeologists who's probably ever lived. He's not dogmatic. He lets the data point him towards what his conclusions are going to be, and just overall like great mentor for me. And I'm looking forward to going and seeing him possibly next month in Belize. And basically, the reconnaissance project is just locating and doing reconnaissance in the jungle. LiDAR is very, very expensive. A lot of you guys have been talking to me about LiDAR, but there's a lot of complications around getting drones out over the jungle, and it's so much more simple to do things on foot. But I'll talk about LiDAR a little bit. So as I said before, my intentions are to present Mesoamerica and the Maya as a second Atlantis and provide insight as to how the study of Mesoamerica can shape how we study other ancient cultures. So we talk a lot about Graham and Randall and Ben and all these guys who have been on Joe Rogan's podcast. We talk about the mainstream. Well, I studied cultural anthropology, and in cultural anthropology, you learn 101 of what mainstream archaeology, what it is and where it comes from. And I just want to give a brief introduction as to how that began. So about 10,000 years ago, let's say, the North African, Africa, but northern Africa in the Sahara, it was a green Sahara. It would go back and forth between it was kind of a swampy area, and it would go back and forth between being arid and being more of a tropical climate. And it had, I believe, two of the biggest lakes that the world had ever seen. And sometime around 8,000 BC, it began to become a more arid place. And by this time, if Atlantis had existed, it was long gone, right? So you have new cultures that are growing in North Africa during this time that it's green, just before it starts becoming the arid desert that we see today. And we know this because we find ancient rock art deep in the caves of the Sahara Desert. And what they depict are ancient people living with ancient animals, some who are extinct today. And we only see these animals, and I should say that the depictions are extremely intricate. They don't focus too much on the anatomy of the people, but they are very, very intricate about the anatomy of the animals that were in North Africa. And these animals today are only found just south of the Sahara Desert, where places are more green. So obviously, put two and two together, we know that the Sahara was much more green. And there's a lot of scientific evidence behind that as well, but I'm just kind of giving you guys the 101. So mainstream archaeology believes in the idea of settlement out of necessity. So basically in Africa, you have people going south of the Sahara Desert, or you have them going east and settling along the Nile Valley. In the Fertile Crescent, Mesopotamia, you have people settling along the Tigris and Euphrates River, the Twin Rivers, and then you have the Indus Valley. And I'll show these here. So these are kind of what a lot of these structures look like. So they believe that, you had these nomadic farming people who I guess cultivated a lot of land, farmed animals. They didn't really need to build cities, because why would they? What would be the spurt of thought to even create civilization? Well, they believe that because there's not much area to settle, they've got to divide walls, build buildings, and then scale up. So then that brings us to, like I was saying, the Nile Valley, the Twin Rivers, and the Indus Valley. These civilizations were, reigned roughly from 4,000, although it can go back a little bit further than that, maybe 5,000 in some cases in the Naqada culture in Egypt. But you also have the Twin Rivers, so you're looking at Babylonia, and then the Indus Valley. And then following this, you have Greco-Roman civilization, which lasts from roughly 1100 BC until the fall of Rome. Okay, so these are the cultures that classical archaeologists study. And this is where this is where all of this originates from, all of these preconceived ideas about how civilizations should behave. And so some of the misconceptions of classical archaeology are an unchanging ancient world. They thought that ancient Egypt was just stagnant for thousands of years. And only later will we learn that there was an old kingdom, then there was an intermediate period, a middle kingdom, and then later a new kingdom. and that ancient Egypt, as well as many other cultures, were constantly fluctuating. They're just as complex as our civilization is today. It's in a constant state of lieu. They also had a Eurocentric bias. So, you had these archaeologists who are coming in from England, and they're looking at these ancient Egyptian sites, and more specifically, ancient sites in Sudan, like the Nubian dynasties that moved down to Egypt, the Kushites. And they looked at this and they go, well, there's no way that the descendants of the people who live in this area today, or the ancestors of the people who live in this area today, were able to accomplish these magnificent feats. And then so they tried to manipulate the data. This is in the 1800s to fit some Eurocentric viewpoint. Monument reconstruction. So a lot of the ruins that you see today are completely rebuilt, and some of them not accurately. They wanted to rebuild monuments to make them tourist attractions so that they could make money, right? So all about self-interest. That's a lot of the stuff that muddies up this study. And then, like I was saying before, there are misconceptions about why civilizations form. And this has a lot to do with classical archaeologists' viewpoints on Atlantis. So whether it's the Azores or whether it's the Richat structure, archaeologists look at this and they go, well, if these are tropical areas with the resources that people needed during these times, why would they build the civilization? They wouldn't do that. And so that's a simplistic way of putting it. That argument can go on for hours, right? But that's the most simplistic way, is they said, well, there's no need for Atlantis to have ever existed. It just doesn't make any sense. But we have New World archaeology. We have new revelations in a new world, and they don't really see as much light as studies of the old world do, because everybody's just obsessed with Egypt and Greece and Rome and ancient Lebanon. It goes on and on and on. So a cauldron of cultures. I'm just going to go through these real quick. These are the cultures that come from each continent in the Americas. So you've got the Apache, the Sioux, the Pueblo in North America. In Central America, you've got the Aztec, the Toltec, the Maya, the Olmec, as well as the Zapotec, and it goes on and on. And then in South America, you've got the Nazca and Palpa, the Inca, and the Amazonians. You've also got Moche, and that's a whole rabbit hole to go down. But today we're going to focus mostly on the mysterious Maya, which I term Mesoamerican Atlantis. So can anybody raise their hand and tell me what this geographic area is? What, Yucatan? I wrote that on the screen. I'm glad you got it. Can you answer the question, though, what Yucatan means? So here's where we start with misconceptions about ancient civilizations and how easily things can just be wrong and how they stick. Okay, so you had Spanish explorers who are landing on the beaches of the Yucatan Peninsula. They're hopping off the boat. They didn't expect to land in the Yucatan. They didn't even know where they were. And they get off and they get off and they see these indigenous people and they go, where are we? Where are we? Where are we? And the Yucatan people are looking at each other and they're like, I can't understand your language. I have no idea what you're saying. But from the Spanish point of view, they're hearing Yucatan, Yucatan, Yucatan. And then the Spanish go, this is the Yucatan. And so for the last 500 or so years, we've been calling it the Yucatan. And so that's how easily things, we call Native Americans Indians because Europeans were planning on landing in India, right? So for a large part of this presentation, I'm going to focus on the Belize Valley because that's probably where my career will take me, and that's where I hope to specialize in. So we're going to look at Coelho and some of the revelations and some of the things that we learn about Coelho. So this is one of the first known sites, one of the first known kingdoms of the Maya, and it dates back to around 1000 BC when monumental architecture or noticeable architecture can be found. And so many of the excavations here were carried out by Norman Hammond. And one thing in particular that he found was 30 plus sacrifice skeletons that dated back to 400 BC. And the skeletons were buried aligned to one another, and they were actually buried aligned astronomically. And they had obsidian blades shoved through their skulls, and they were dismembered and all this crazy stuff. And so this is one of the first things where archaeologists really start accepting, okay, the Maya maybe weren't this utopian, peaceful society that archaeologists have always tried to say they were. They were probably a little bit violent. But something that's interesting about this is So Jose Calderon, he traveled to Palenque to see the Temple of the Sun. And I was just there. These two photos in the center and on the right are photos that I took, except the one on the right is from a different site that we'll get to. But Jose Calderon, he wants to kind of push this idea. He's taking this approach from old world archeology, and he has these preconceived ideas that he wants to bend the data to fit his idea and his fraternity's idea of what he thinks that Mesoamerica should have been like, or what the Maya should have been like, because they had this idea that it was a utopia, right? So Jose Calderon, this left mural is his illustration. Now you'll see that it looks like they're standing on two boxes or maybe altars that have glyphs on them. Those are completely made up. In the center, you can see that the Maya man on the left is actually standing on top of a slave, and there are anatomical things that you can study about these glyphs that show you sort of that these people being depicted are not Maya people from Palenque, right? And so he lied about that. And then one other thing I want to show you guys is that in Yaxchilan, this is a little bit graphic. So that is a queen of Yaxchilan who she probably lived sometime around 700 AD. And so the Maya would do something called bloodletting, where they would try to summon the spirit of their ancestors to gain wisdom. And the king would rub he would run a vine with thorns through his private area, and he would bleed onto the ground. And as he was pulling that vine out, the queen would run that same vine through a hole in her tongue, and they would bleed all over the ground and light essence and try to summon the spirit of their ancestors. So when all of this starts to come to light, and when the Maya code is finally broken by a team from Lindisfarne, and we're able to learn the language of the Maya and know what they're actually writing in their glyphs, it becomes undeniable that this is a violent civilization. And there's kind of a turn there. This is in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. So the study of the Maya getting really complex is fairly recent. But there was a revelation and attitude underneath Lindisfarne. And it was Mesoamerican archaeologists just letting the data point them where it may, without any preconceived ideas. And so if you spend time in Mesoamerica around archaeologists, they're some of the most positive people. They're not dogmatic. Everybody's just happy to be out in the hot, nasty, dangerous jungle finding stuff that nobody's ever seen before, right? So the Maya did not have to build cities to survive. This is one of the major misconception about why civilizations are even formed. Okay, so Coelho was within just about 3 miles of fresh water, and they built these underground tunnels. So if you're walking in the jungle in Central America and you hear running water but there's no river around you, start looking for cracks in the ground. And there are underground chambers, underground aqueducts, where they would basically traffic the water from a river back to a reservoir that they would create next to their civilization, next to their city. This is me inside of an aqueduct in Palenque's outer ruins deep in the jungle. So these aqueducts were unnecessarily tall. I'm only 5'10" and a half. And and so this is probably 8 or 9 feet tall. And it goes on for, I don't know, probably maybe close to a mile. This is a map of Palenque done by my mentor, Dr. Ed Barnhart, and his friend Dr. Kirk French. So you see all the blue parts, all the blue lines and everything. Those are aqueducts that lead to sometimes reservoirs. So Palenque is very extensive, built on the side of a mountain, amongst all the resources that the Maya would have already needed to survive. They had food like maize, which is corn, beans, sweet potatoes, cacao, honey, avocados, papayas, bananas, passion fruit, fish, wild game, so on, so on, so on. These were not people who built these cities as a result of their environment decaying and they need to build cities and huddle together. It's likely that they did this out of pure genius and innovation, and we're all naturally creative. We don't have to be held to this stringent idea of what modern day people think that we should do, or what anybody thinks we should do. So settlement out of necessity, old world versus the new world. There's just a big difference in why civilization even began. So this is Saros. This is in Belize. This is right on the ocean. So the Maya had some, I wouldn't call it seafaring boats, but they had boats that allowed them to travel up and down the Yucatan's coast, right? So this is right next to saltwater where they could fish, and there's also freshwater reservoirs that they built and freshwater rivers nearby as well. This is Lamanai. This is more of in central Belize. This is right next to a freshwater river, and as you can see, it's lush jungle with all the resources they would need to survive. This is Zenantanish. This is in western Belize, right next to the Guatemalan border. As you can see, they have springs, cenotes, freshwater rivers, and in lush jungle, everything they needed to survive. In Caracal, this is deep in the jungle. This is a LiDAR scan that detected, you can't see it on this scan, but if there are bigger scans and bigger maps, that there are freshwater rivers nearby, but this is built in a very mountainous area. And they had their own freshwater reservoirs and aqueducts that they built, all in a lush jungle that old world archaeologists look at, and there is no answer as to why they built these civilizations, right? People can do anything, they could do whatever they want because we're genius people that are creative and innovative. These are the known Maya sites that are around the Yucatan Peninsula and going more into Central America. And every little gap that you see on the right, in the right photo, all these little gaps where you don't see green dots, I promise you, there are lost cities in there, hundreds of them. The Maya were more than 3 times the size of medieval Europe during their day. And there were millions and millions and millions of people living. You can book a hotel room somewhere in the Yucatan Peninsula, and if there's a small forest next to the hotel room, just walk around and you'll find stela. A stela is probably I don't know, sometimes they're as big as this banner behind me, and it basically tells the story of the Maya people, where they're from in that area. You might find a stela, you might find statues, or even an old building. It's absolutely littered with the remnants of a lost civilization. They also built their cities to be astronomically aligned. So they followed the summer solstice sunset. They followed Venus setting, which was very important to them. They followed the zenith passage. They followed the summer solstice sunrise. Goes on and on and on. And in all of their cities, from the pre-classic to the classic, and in the post-classic, they started slacking, sort of in the same way that Egypt does. You see, in the Old Kingdom, you see the most megalithic and the largest architecture in all of ancient Egypt, and it starts to wane, right, which is a bit of a mystery. So let's get into the fun stuff. How to find a lost city, ruins of the jungle and desert. And this is sort of what I do. This is what I get giddy about, right? So this comes from, these 4 steps come from Dr. Edwin Barnhart. So number 1, you want to follow oral tradition and local knowledge. So anytime that Dr. Barnhart was in the jungle, he found an ancient city in Belize that he named Ma'ashna, which means monkey house, because there were howler monkeys living in the temple when he arrived, and they were pissed that they came in there and started having lunch inside their temples, and so he named it after these monkeys. But he would have never found that had he not listened to the oral traditions and the rumors and legends of the local Maya people of the northern Belize Valley, right? And even in Palenque, when he was looking for ruins, and in Chiapas, he only ever found the ruins when he listened to the local people. And so I have some diagrams up here of Maya lost civilizations. The Egyptians also talk about Zep Tepi, and then the Aztecs talk about Aztlan, which, maybe there's some connection there to Atlantis, is what a lot of people theorize. So another thing you need to do is you need to look at the geography and identify what could have been possible ancient trade routes. So you look at where you know that cities would exist, you look at fresh water in the middle, you look at geography of how people could have traveled from one place to another, and you kind of spitball, right? And LiDAR is super expensive, as I said earlier. It's not as easy as it sounds. And there's a lot of bureaucratic complications that come with that. So that's also step 3, geological and topographic features. And then at the end, aerial and satellite imagery, which I put $3 signs because it is expensive. So where are the ruins of Atlantis? There haven't been any exact ruins found. But around 10,000 BC, And guys like Randall may know this a bit better than me. This isn't really my specialty, but it's something I wanted to chime in. Africa was in the middle of the Neolithic subpluvial or African human period, which is when, like I was saying earlier, Africa would go back and forth between this swampy, arid, desert back to a tropical region, and there were massive lakes in the area. So you've got to look at this ancient geography and topography and kind of infer, well, where would a civilization exist? Now, this is something that I'm just kind of putting this out there for a geologist or somebody who's interested in this to kind of pick up on this idea if they haven't thought of it before. But and so this area was also fairly similar to the area of Mexico in the Yucatan Peninsula about 2,000 years ago. If you've ever been to some areas in Mexico, it'll be arid desert that turns to swamp immediately after you drive 50 miles. So there's a lot to learn from studying ancient sites and where ancient civilizations grew, their origins in Mesoamerica. I think that there's a lot to learn there that can be taken back to the old world. And a lot of this would have to be independent research. No major university is going to fund something based on this simple idea. But simple ideas are usually, common sense usually prevails. So this is El Tajín. This is in a more arid place in Mexico that is arid, swamp. And so on the left side, you see the main pyramid of El Tajín. That has been fully excavated. But look at the giant mounds around it on the left side. This is an older photo. If you were flying over that or walking by like I have done on plenty of occasions in Central America, I'm walking by a mound and Dr. Barnhart goes, look at that mound right there. And you stare at it for long enough and you go, oh, that's a pyramid. And so this is just an example. This was built in about 1000 AD. So just 1,000 years ago, it's completely covered up. This is Tulum on the left after excavation. I couldn't find photos of Tulum being excavated, but that bottom floor had almost been completely covered by soil deposition and rainfall, sediment displacement. And then on the right, you've got Koba. And so Koba, you can see that front and side have been excavated, but the left and back side of it just fade into the jungle. They're completely covered up. You wouldn't be able to see this aerially. Not very easily unless the temple was coming out of the top, but even the temples will be grown over, and I'll show this later at a different site in Guatemala. So this is Lamanai before excavation. So on the left side, you can see that the stairwell's been excavated, the top temple has been excavated, but this just looked like a mossy, grassy hill before any of these excavations were done. And also in Lamanai, there are structures dating back to 900 BC, so almost 2,000 years ago, that have been detected more, I didn't want to say 20, but I've heard the number 20 from researchers that have been there on the site, 20 meters below the surface of the Lamanai Plaza. So over time, the soil has risen around the structure and buried it more than, upwards of 15 meters under the ground. So how quickly are cities buried? This isn't something that can be answered very easily, depending on where geologically and geographically, it's totally different. But for an entire site to be covered up by soil and by grass due to erosion, sedimentation, plant growth, and rainfall causing sediment disposition that buries the structure, the estimated time is around 1,000 years just for it to be completely covered up. But that's not always the case, and I'll show you something that I found. So this is in the outer ruins of Palenque, and I had thought initially, I was walking through the jungle, and there's this big hole in the ground. It's about the size of a manhole. And I can tell that there's architecture on the inside. It's not just like a sinkhole to a cave. So I jump down inside, there's bats all inside, and I'm thinking, wow, I'm in the middle of an underground chamber that the Maya built in this jungle, and I guess the ceiling has fallen in. Well, I learned a little bit later on that this kind of architecture with these vaulted ceilings was never done underground. This was completely above ground. I jumped into the ceiling of a temple that had been completely buried by the jungle. And these temples are from floor to ceiling in here, and it was completely buried off the side of this mountain. So I know everybody loves LiDAR. So this is one of the most notorious LiDAR scans that's ever been done in Central America, where they discovered more than 60,000 structures in the Maya Petén region of Guatemala. So I have reached out to somebody that I know there. I haven't gone to this site yet, but these are sort of with minor excavations. These are what some of the temples or pyramids look like in the jungle. Now, these are about 60-foot tall pyramids, roughly the size of the Temple of Inscriptions at Palenque, maybe just a little bit shorter. So you can see that stairway on the left, that is not the native stairway. That is a stairway that researchers built to be able to get up to the top more easily. And the only reason that the temple is uncovered is because that's where they start, at the top, and they excavate down. So these structures are extremely hard to find, and even the giant structures are covered. And I'm sorry, this site was probably built anywhere from, it's hard to say, I would say 200 AD to 500 AD. Now on the left side, it covers about, I want to say about 5 square miles, this entire city. But it was only discovered less than about 10 miles into the jungle. And the jungle itself is 9,000 square miles. And this city full of 60,000 structures had never been discovered before. But look at the rest of the jungle north of it. So you're talking about hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of lost cities that are just sitting in the jungle that nobody but birds and snakes have seen for the last 1,000 to 2,000 years. And I said it on the Snake Bros podcast, as many lost cities as you think are out there, there are way, way, way more. So we're leaving Central America for just a second. This guy's one of my heroes, even though he's dead. So in May of 1925, Percy Fawcett went missing in the Mato Grosso region of Bolivia's Amazon jungle, and he was looking for the ruins of a once great civilization. And he was only following local oral tradition. And he was headed to a very remote place in Bolivia outside of Brazil. And he went missing, and they thought that he never found his lost city. They thought he never found the location. He was just following these naive native people who were telling him these legends of these lost civilizations deep into the Amazon, and they thought that he was a fool, that these modern day people living in the Amazon were never capable of the things that European civilizations were capable of. Well, nearly 100 years later to his disappearance, LiDAR scans would reveal extensive ancient road networks, aqueducts, geoglyphs, structures, and pyramids deep within the Amazon jungle in the precise area that Percy Fawcett sent the last letter to his wife from Dead Horse Camp. So he was right. Now traveling to the other side of the world, just giving you guys another example of how quickly things become buried in even arid climates, mostly arid climates, but this also existed, the city of Jericho also existed in a time when the Middle East was much more fertile. So the walls of Jericho were, archaeologically, we know that they were rebuilt over time from the point of about 8300 BC until 1400 BC when Jericho was sacked by the Israelites. And the earliest evidence of the walled construction has been discovered nearly 40 feet underneath the surface. So let's just have fun with this. Let's think about if Atlantis were to exist, how far would you have to dig somewhere in northern Africa, in the Sahara, in the Azores? How far underneath the ground would it be if it wasn't just completely blown to pieces, right? So where to look for an ancient city? Let's just spitball here. Let's go back to what we were talking about earlier. So now that with everything I've said before, any geologist who's enthusiastic about this topic could pick up on this from here. But you're going to want to look for ancient freshwater rivers and lakes, trade routes. You want to follow oral traditions, which that could even be Solon's story of Atlantis. I mean, that's probably the best one to follow, right? And Randall has a very in-depth, 10-hour discussion on this topic as well. So I just want to reiterate the idea of seeing the old world through a new lens. The very positive, not dogmatic archaeologists who work in Mesoamerica are a great example of the type of archaeologists that we should have all over the world, who are extremely positive. They're happy to be in that swampy, dangerous jungle with tons of mosquitoes and snakes, just to discover things that nobody else has seen before. And part of me thinks that that area of the world is so positive because things haven't been found, because there are things to discover. Out in Egypt, it becomes very dogmatic because most megalithic architecture has already been discovered. So you've got people sinking their claws into those sites, and they invest their pride and their time and their personal, I guess their self-value into these sites, and their own personal interests start to bleed through to the science, right? But Mesoamerica is like a frontier. There's no time for that. In some cases there are, but those people are ostracized and they alienate themselves from the rest of the archaeological community. I won't name any names. More mysteries of Middle America, because we have a little bit of time. These are some things that with cosmic summits in the future, I would love to delve into. So mysterious visitors, ancient technology, and symbolism. All right, so this one's really cool. I took two of these photos. I took the photo on the left and the photo on the right, not the one in the middle. So at an Olmec site in Villahermosa, it's a swampy area where the Olmec lived. I don't know if most of you guys have heard of the Olmec. They're usually seen as the mother culture of Mesoamerica. They are the first culture to establish the idea of divine kingship in Mesoamerica. But what's really interesting is that this is Monument 13 on the left. So let's look at the Traveler, and all of these were constructed in around 800 BC. So the Olmec glyphs that you see on the right, they basically spell out that they referred to this figure that is depicted here as the Traveler. And if you look at him, you can tell he has a flag, he has a turban on, he has a beard, he's wearing pointed shoes. And that's all great, except for the fact that nobody in Middle America wore turbans or had beards. The Olmec were notorious for not being, the Olmec and Native Americans in general were notorious for not being able to grow very much facial hair, like me. And but around this time, and then you also see the bearded man, which is I believe it may be a stucco head of a bearded man with a sharp chin. They believe that he's wearing a turban. That's probably not his hair. And so this still puzzles archaeologists today in Middle America. Nobody has really given a definitive assertion as to what they believe this is, because they're actually honest in Mesoamerica. When they don't know, they say they don't know. But what's really interesting is around this time in 800 BC, there were expeditions, ocean-faring, sea-faring expeditions being launched from the Mediterranean Sea that the Phoenicians were launching to travel all the way around the coast of Africa and back. But what's really interesting is research has shown that if you just send a boat out a little bit too far west when they leave the Mediterranean, a current carries them all the way across the ocean down into the Gulf of Mexico. And this has been proven on one or two occasions. So one of the great mysteries is, are these Olmec altars and stela depicting ancient Phoenician visitors that accidentally landed in North America, or I'm sorry, in Central America. And so if you ask, archaeologists who buy into the mainstream, they go, oh, well, that's all speculation. There was nobody here. There was nobody here in the Americas from the other side of the world before Columbus, right? And that's a little bit ridiculous to say. So furthermore, lost Mayan astronomical knowledge. So many pages of the Maya codices list numbers that allow the Maya to predict lunar and solar eclipses, phase of the moon, and movements of Mars, Venus, and other planets. But we have a very limited knowledge of we have a very limited view of what they were knowledgeable of, because in 1562, Diego de Landa, I believe in Merida, Mexico, in the Yucatan, he burned multiple pyres of these books. Now, a Maya codice, when it's totally folded together, is about this big, right? But it's got, it's got dozens of pages inside of it that are densely written. So if he were burning multiple pyres, how big is that? This tall, full of books that talk about the Maya civilization and their knowledge. And of these multiple pyres, only 4 survive today. And of those 4, we know almost that 4 basically entails almost everything that we know about lost Mayan knowledge. And so if we continue, We also have the lost knowledge of Mesoamerican origin. And I put Mesoamerican instead of Maya for this reason. The Aztecs claimed that they were descendants of the people of Aztlan, which I put Atlantis question mark. There's a lot of people making that connection. With likely thousands of Aztec and Maya codices that were burned or stolen, we may never know the full context of the Mesoamerican origin story. Because in the Popol Vuh, which is a Maya codice, they in some ways talk about their origin, and I'll talk about that in just a minute, but they don't really give any geographic details or any cultural details that entail where they are from. Nothing that's as specific as what the Aztecs, as they claim their origin is. So ancient symbolism in architecture. So Mayan E-groups are extremely common throughout the Maya world. They line up with solstices, but they can't figure out why these E-groups are built. So you see, so what you're seeing here is I believe a temple, the pyramid at Uxmal, and it is facing a temple in front of it, and they call it an E-group because you have a triad of temples facing a pyramid, and that's just what they call an E-group. That's the simplest way to term it. And then at Teotihuacan, which is in the Valley of Mexico, that is not a Maya site. But at Teotihuacan, it is likely inferred, but just can't be proven, maybe in the same way that the pyramids of Giza are, but it's pretty well accepted that the pyramids of Giza are aligned to what we see today as Orion's belt. Teotihuacan was aligned to the same thing. And we can learn a lot about cultures all over the world by looking at the way that they built their cities, looking at the celestial alignments, looking at the symbolism. So this is Washington, D.C., the capital of our nation, and it obviously has influence that dates back to the founding of our country. So sacred geometry in Maya temples. So this took a long time for it to be proven, and this would take me 30 more minutes to delve into this, but you guys will have to come back to a Cosmic in the future to get this one. But sacred geometry in Maya temples, so they knew the golden rule. Was it 1 to 1.618, something like that? They knew that, and they depicted that in the codices that we have. They were depicting sacred geometry. And Linda Sheely, who's one of the best, most prolific Mayanist that ever lived. She was the mentor to my mentor, Dr. Ed Barnhart. And one of his friends, Christopher Powell, finally discovered the secret. He realized how the Maya used sacred geometry in their architecture. And she told him, and this is how undogmatic these are, compare this to archaeologists that we all know from Egypt. You would never hear somebody like from specific people in Egypt say something like this, but she told him, you solved the mystery of Maya sacred geometry because you hadn't learned enough to confuse yourself. Now imagine the humility of an academic saying that they could learn so much, they could become so wise that they would become foolish. So what's also interesting is it took this guy, I should also mention that Christopher Powell is not an archaeologist. I believe that he was an engineer, which is, that's a very respectable, you have to be very knowledgeable to be in that field, but he wasn't an archaeologist. He wasn't part of the Good Boys Club, and he figured this out. And it took this guy to come in from the outside to go read the Popol Vuh to realize that the beginning of the Popol Vuh is talking about sacred geometry when no other Maya archaeologist had realized this. It says, great is its performance and its account of the completion and germination of all of the earth, its four corners and four sides. All then was measured and staked out into four divisions, doubling over and stretching the measuring cords up to the sky and back down to the earth. This is exactly the way that remote Maya tribes in the Lacandon jungle still build their homes today. They use a cord and they double over the cord and they use sacred geometry in this way, in this simplistic way that's, what has been left over from the Maya culture. They still build their homes using this today. Now let's talk about unknown architects and lost civilizations real quick. So this is Teotihuacan. So, when Mesoamerica is first being studied, archaeologists come in and they go, this is definitely Toltec. Yeah, this is definitely Toltec. And then new archaeologists come in and they discover cultural evidence that doesn't link Teotihuacan to the Toltec, and some of the originally dogmatic archaeologists go, oh God, it was the Teotihuacanos. That's who built this site. And so we still don't know who built Teotihuacan. Cholula as well. It's never been irrefutably proven who built Cholula. But this is widely renowned as one of the biggest as far as mass, not height, pyramids in the entire world. Maybe the biggest as far as mass goes. There is an ancient city called Ciudad Blanca. And this is written about in inscriptions in multiple different Maya cities. This was a great Maya city that existed somewhere, possibly in northern Honduras, maybe even Chiapas. And it's written about in the inscriptions of multiple other cities, but it's never been found. But archaeologists don't deny that it certainly does exist. And this is one of the, if it were to be found, it would be, as it's regarded in other Mayan civilizations, one of the greatest cities of the Maya that ever did exist, but it's never been discovered. Now, Lacamha, this is getting into my territory. Lacamha is mentioned about in the city of, it's mentioned in the city of Bonampak, it's mentioned in the city of Palenque and Yaxchilan. I believe maybe Tonina as well. This is in southern Chiapas in the Lacandon jungle. Lacamha is said to be the city where, has anybody here ever heard of the Temple of Inscriptions or Pakal's tomb in the Maya world? It was one of the first Mayan pyramids that had an Egyptian tomb inside of it, except this one actually was a tomb. But it's one of the most famous Mayan pyramids that has ever existed. And it is said in the inscriptions that I believe in the Temple of the Lady Sakuk, who was Pakal's mother, it is said that she came from the city of Lacamha and brought her son Pakal, who was one of the greatest Maya kings ever lived, from the city of Lacamha. In the city of Lacamha, the origins of the greatest Maya king who has ever lived has never been discovered. But it's also likely near the lake of Lacanha. This is what the Lacandon Maya people call this lake. Now, this lake is so far out in the remote jungle west of Bonampak that no sane archaeologist would actually go out there without being paid to go out and survey this site. So you can probably guess what I have planned in the future. So Bonampak, the road to Bonampak, in my opinion, when I tell people about how much we know about Mesoamerica and why I think Mesoamerica is another Atlantis, is I believe that the jungle, the Lacandon jungle that you're looking at right now, and the road to Bonampak is very symbolic of just a little bit that we know about the Mesoamerican world. So that road that curves down to Bonampak, it's about a 20-minute drive. It's right, just Bonampak is a lost city that half of it hasn't been excavated, and it's so shallow into the Lacandon jungle. Look at how much is left to be. That is all completely uncharted jungle. It is very likely that Ciudad Blanca and the city of Lacanha exist in this jungle. That's something I have on down the pipeline as I return to Mexico and Belize later this year, and I hope that in Cosmic Summits in the future, I can tell you guys about things that I find and research that I'm doing. Thank you guys all very, very much.
I told you, right? Next Indiana Jones.